Good morning, everyone. I admire your courage in staying by till the very last meeting, and I trust the Lord will bless you and make it worth your while. Question was left for me here, which I can answer very briefly. Pastor Larson, what is the understanding of the dried bones mentioned in Ezekiel? Please explain the dry bones. What does it mean? I believe if you read the chapter from beginning to end, it's all right there. The dried bones represent the people of Israel and Judah, who were two different nations for a while, and both went into captivity. And the Lord is saying that he's going to bring them back from captivity. I wonder if I need to adjust these a little bit. And then he further uses the illustration of two sticks. One stick for Judah and the house of Israel, his companions. One stick for Joseph and the house of Israel, his companions. He says they're going to be one. There won't be two nations anymore. There won't be a Judah and Israel. There'll just be Israel. And that was fulfilled. When the people came back from Babylon, there was never more two nations. It was just Israel. From then on, actually it was more often called Judah, but it was just one nation. And today they still use that. If you go to what we used to call Palestine and mention Palestine, they'll say, no, we're not Palestine, we're Israel. They told us at the border when we said something about Palestine, they said there's no such thing as Palestine. This is Israel. They're very sure that they want to be called that. Well, I want to talk to you this last time about something very practical, which I call Satan's third brigade. Satan's third brigade. As I see it, the devil has three brigades. When he wants to try to stop a work of the Lord that's being done, he first calls out his persecutors. That's the first brigade. And he tried to scare us with his persecutors, but that didn't work. We're still here and growing and thriving, and the number of people who are becoming identified with the historic movement sometimes takes gigantic leaps. Just a short while ago, we learned that down in Guatemala, which is down south of us in Central America, small country down there, more than 1,000 people have taken a stand that they will not go along with plans to become part of the World Council of Churches and so forth, the ecumenical movement, and have decided that they are going to be independent of the conference, and they're calling for help. And John Grossball is going down to help them sometime in the month of November, as I understand the plans. And of course, down in Africa, there were 3,000 at one time, and 1,000 more in another country. And in the States, I would say there has been a steady growth, but we're being attacked by fanatics, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. The devil has his three brigades. First, the persecutors. Second, the dividers. As you know, there's been a division of thought between some of the ministries, which has been hurtful to all of us. But I tell people, let's not worry over much about that, because it's just one of the things that we have to work our way past. I think of the time when Luther and Zwingli had such a terrible disagreement over the Lord's Supper, and how hurtful that was. And it even hurts us even today when we go back and read about it. It still hurts us to read about it, but it didn't stop the Reformation. But the Third Brigade could stop the Reformation. The Third Brigade could stop the historic movement. And the Third Brigade is the fanatics. Am I talking loud enough?
Yes.
Everything all right? The Third Brigade is the fanatics. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the problem of fanaticism this morning. We'll start with a series of quotations. Christian Service, page 40. When Satan sees that the Lord is blessing his people and preparing them to discern his delusions, he will work with his masterly power to bring in fanaticism. And then we'll read a little further on that it'll almost destroy the Reformation, and that's where I get my thought. The devil cannot stop us by persecution. The devil cannot stop us by division, but he might stop us with fanaticism, because fanaticism gets right into the midst of our being and does horrible damage. So let's go on. When the people are seeing that the Lord is blessing his people and preparing them to discern his delusions, we have seen a tremendous amount of growth. Perhaps it's not so vividly clear in your mind as it is in mine, because I remember the day in Loma Linda. I remember it very, very clearly when I took my public stand against the falsehoods that were being preached by Desmond Ford. And I tell you, I stopped a lot of bullets. But the main thing was that I was like a fence post in the middle of a great big pasture. Betty and I walked up the trail here behind the church, and that lovely spot where you can see the paddocks and the horses and the lovely green grass all around. Since we come from a desert land, we're very impressed with the greenness of everything. We have green at a certain season of the year in Southern California, but not all year. The rest of the time it turns dry and brown, but we never say that. We always say it's golden. So we have a golden season in California. We have a green season, but you have the green all year round. But when I took my public stand, there was nobody in the whole world that I knew of that was standing against apostasy. I was just like a fence post in the middle of a huge field, and people were shooting at me from all sides. And that was in 1977, just about 20 years ago. And from that time until now, it's really remarkable what has happened. At that time, there wasn't any Heartland Institute. There wasn't any Hope International. There wasn't any Steps to Life. There weren't any of the about 30 other ministries that we have over in the States. And there wasn't any Gazeley, so far as I know, in 1977. Was there a Gazeley at that time? Gazeley movement? And so the Lord has really been working, and the devil has been very concerned. You can be sure about that. And he tried to scare us. We have been pushed around by forces that were quite vigorous and quite merciless in what they were doing to us. That didn't stop us. And we have suffered the pains of division, and I've been working, as I told you last night, I've been working very hard to try to bring this division to an end, and I hope you'll say a little prayer for me once in a while, because peacemakers usually end up getting clobbered by both sides, you know. And I hope that doesn't happen to me. But right now, by far our biggest problem is fanaticism. It may not have hit you so hard over here, but it's really ravaging us over in the States. The fanaticism that comes in from people who appear to be very sincere, we cannot pass judgment on that, but they give every outward appearance of sincerity. And they come to the meetings like this. Whenever there's an independent camp meeting, a historic camp meeting, you can expect some of them to be on the ground, passing out their tracts, drawing people aside here and there for little private conversations, trying to sell them on their particular idea of what they think is truth. And it's not easy to know how to relate to them. When somebody comes to you with apparently very great sincerity and very great apparent honesty, and solemnly urges you to accept the fact that 2 + 2 = 175, so to speak, how do you answer that? It's not easy to do. You have a tendency to become impatient, but we mustn't do that. We have to remember that we can't help them if we become impatient with them. We have to be as patient as we can be, but at the same time we must be firm, as I will show you in just a few moments now. In the reference that I made last night to a page of statements about error and deception, I have that page here. And I can leave a copy of that with you if you would like to have it. It's a whole page of statements, warnings about the danger of listening to error. And when people, as I told you last night, when people press me with questions about the last day church and what form it will be and what form it's going to be from now on, I tell them, I really don't know. I really don't know what form the church will take, but as far as I'm concerned, my practical questions are answered by this statement, this series of statements about the danger of listening to error. I simply cannot afford to go where error is being, as she puts it, forced home by the power of the will, and in addition to that, possibly by the trickery and the just trickery of what they call neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. I'm sure you're hearing about that over here, and the danger of having some amateur hypnotist try to practice NLP on you when you go to church. He might succeed someday, and you'll be surprised what the results of that can be. I'm preparing a little tract right now. I dashed it off in a big hurry just before I left home, and took it to the printers and got an acceptable price on it. I will plan to shape it up and get it printed when I get home. It's entitled "The Most Dangerous Day," and the subtitle is "Are You Safe on the Sabbath?" And I try to show there that for Seventh-day Adventists in this particular time and place, the most dangerous day of all the week is the Sabbath. If I am misled by false interpretations of the Bible, that will happen to me on Sabbath. If I am misled by false accusations against the people who are trying to be faithful, like you are trying to be here, that will happen to me on Sabbath. If I am manipulated by NLP, that will happen to me on Sabbath. So I'm trying to point out that Sabbath is the most dangerous day of the whole week for any Seventh-day Adventist now, at least in this part of the world, because that's when the people who are leading folks astray want to exercise their wiles on us. And so when we go to, as I proposed in the track, when I wake up on Sabbath morning, I should be thinking thoughts like these. Where shall I worship this morning? Shall I go to a place where there's lots of error being taught and celebration worship being used freely and expose myself to those hideous dangers? Surely I wouldn't do that. Shall I choose a place where the error is smaller, only little bits of error, and then celebration is being introduced a little more tactfully, a little more gradually, step by step, which the North American division is training its pastors how to do that. Did I tell you that? I have a tape that I listen to. It's about 2 hours, and actually 2 tapes, videotapes, which were never intended to fall into my hands, but they did fall into my hands. And here are people on the tapes from the North American Division headquarters describing how they are going to get celebration into every church in the North American Division. And those who oppose it are to be dealt with as people with psychological problems. They can't handle change. The idea that there might be some valid reason for them resisting is never given a moment's consideration. It's just they're people with psychological problems. They can't handle change, so handle them like this. And if necessary, write them off, get rid of them. That was what it really amounted to. And so the NLP thing is being very strongly pressed there, along with celebration worship. Now, it's Sabbath morning. I'm thinking about where shall I go. And I ended up with the question, should I go to a place where there's absolutely no NLP being practiced, absolutely no celebration worship being tolerated, and no comprehension, no understanding departure from truth? If we ever depart from truth, it's done because we made a mistake. It's our intention to be absolutely loyal, absolutely faithful to the historic Adventist message. And so I try to propose to them that you ought to choose to go to a place where you're safe on Sabbath. And so don't be caught up in the fact that Sabbath is the most dangerous day. We're going on now with what we have to say about this. Acts of the Apostles, page 348. In every age, Satan has sought to impair the efforts of God's servants by introducing into the church a spirit of fanaticism. She mentions the fanaticism that troubled Paul and his work, troubled Wycliffe, troubled Luther, and the other reformers. And then she adds this line: they encountered the wiles by which the enemy seeks to lead into fanaticism overzealous, unbalanced, and unsanctified minds. Well, I want to believe that a person can be overzealous and still be sincere, can be unbalanced and still be sincere, can even be unsanctified and still be sincere, honestly misled. So we're not trying to pass judgment upon their experience in that sense, but we do have to recognize what they're doing, which is really very, very dangerous. And she mentions Luther, Great Controversy, page 186. She mentions Luther during the time when he was imprisoned in the castle in Wartburg, put there by the Elector of Saxony for his safety. She says while he was there, people all around the country realized that they had to do something because he couldn't do anything as they saw it. And so they got busy and went to work for the Lord, and a lot of wonderful things happened in that sense, and I like to think about that. Because, we have some older men leading the historic movement at this moment. Do you ever think of that? Ron Spear is wanting to retire. We have youngsters like Colin Standish and Russell Standish who are probably only 55 or 60 years old. I don't know how old they are. 62? Oh dear, that's worse than I thought. And we have a youngster like John Grossball, who's just a young kid, about 50, I think. But here's Ralph Larson, 76, and here's Ron Spear, 72, and we're not going to be around a lot longer. And so we look out with a bit of concern. Who's going to carry the torch when we're gone? Well, I don't know how old Brother Cabin is. He looks pretty young to me, but... Pardon me? You're 76 also? Well. Greetings. No, Betty reminds me I'm not 76 until November 14, which is next month. But I'm beginning to feel it, if you know what I mean. Going on with these quotations. After talking about Luther and what was going on, she says, but Satan was not idle. He now attempted what he has attempted in every other reformatory movement. That interests me. Every reformatory movement will bring out a horde of fanatics. He now attempted what he has attempted in every other reformatory movement, to deceive and destroy the people by palming off on them a counterfeit in place of the true work of God. We need to think about that. And again on page 187 of Great Controversy, from the professed friends of the Reformation had risen its worst enemies. They brought it to the verge of ruin. The Pope with persecution and the Emperor with persecution could not stop the Reformation. The division could not stop the Reformation, but the fanatics brought it to the very edge of disaster, the verge of ruin. And this causes me to think very, very seriously about the fanaticism in our time. And then on page 193 of Great Controversy, she points out that the only thing that saved the Reformation was the absolutely inflexible stand of Martin Luther. Fearlessly did Luther defend the gospel from the attacks which came from every quarter. He stood firm as a rock against the fanaticism that sought to ally itself with the Reformation. Well, I took that as my marching orders. And I told the people back in the States where I've been this last year, camp meetings and whatnot, this last year, seminars and camp meetings, you're going to sense a new firmness in my language. I'm going to be more bold and more firm and more decided than I used to be, because I can see what's happening, and I have the example here that it was only the absolutely firm stand of Martin Luther that saved the Reformation from disaster. If he had been willing to compromise in any degree, the Reformation could have gone down the tubes, as we stay in the States. And so, with all of that as background, I ask you to shift your mind now to 1844. 1844 was one of the world's greatest reformatory movements, and the devil adopted his usual tactics. First, he tried persecution. Second, he tried division. And when that didn't work, he brought on the fanatics. And Ellen White records in her writings that when she was called upon by God to become a special messenger for him, this was her first job, to fight the fanatics. She spent about 10 years really doing very little else except going from place to place to meet the fanaticism. And this is well outlined for us in the volume of her biography prepared by Arthur White, her grandson. A very valuable set of books. If you can get those and read them, you'll find them very valuable to you. And so this took about 10 years, and she experienced a lot of anguish and a lot of trouble fighting the fanatics, but she knew that she had to do it. The Lord told her to do it. And if you have a CD-ROM, if you have access to a CD-ROM, look up the word fanaticism, you'll find about 500 hits in there. And they mostly deal with those early years. So she knew very well the intensity of the battle against fanaticism, and she knew something else, and this is what I want you to notice now. She knew that it would reappear in the very closing days of the message. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 16. Fanaticism will appear in the very midst of us. And page 14, same volume. Every phase of fanaticism and erroneous theories claiming to be the truth will be brought in among the remnant by the people of God. Manuscript Releases, Volume 5, page 245. Fanaticism will come in as it always has when God works. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 25. Every conceivable, fanciful, and deceptive doctrine will be presented by men who think that they have the truth. Like I said, it's hard to know how to deal with these brethren. They seem to be so earnest. They seem to be so sincere, but they're so wild. Oh, man. When a man comes along, now I'm reaching far down the line, and I shouldn't do this, but just this one little point. When a man comes along that you have no reason to have any disrespect for, he's been a faithful Christian so far as you know, and he publishes and signs his name to a statement that Abraham kept the Passover 450 years before the Passover occurred. Are you with me? The Passover started when Moses led the people out of Egypt, right? Abraham was 450 to 500 years before that. And this brother publishes to the world, we must recognize that Abraham kept the Passover. And he even published a strong suspicion that Noah kept the Passover before the flood. You don't, what do you say to a man like that? What do you say to people who are hooked on that? Well, my first thought is no sensible person would ever pay the least bit of attention to that, but some people do. Some people get hooked on that stuff, weird as it is, wild as it is. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Every phase of fanaticism, and I want to tell you that's literally true. The name of God, the feast days, the reapplication of prophecies, the attitude in prayer, you just go on and on and on. the 5 angels of Revelation, where we've always been talking about 3 angels. Some people want to fight over how many angels there were there. And on Selected Messages, page 47, you will be exposed to the fallacies of satanic agencies. Fearful waves of fanaticism will come in. It's practically like a tidal wave, in my view. So what do we do? Do we just ignore it and hope it will go away? No, that will not work. Mind, Character, and Personality, Volume 1, page 43. Fanaticism, once started and left unchecked, is as hard to quench as a fire which has obtained hold of a building. So we have to do something about it. Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 221. I was instructed that fanaticism, similar to that which we were called to meet after the passing of time in 1844, would come in among us again. And in the closing days of the message, that we must meet this evil just as decidedly now as when we met it in our early experiences. We must call fanaticism by its right name, and we must call heresy by its right name. It has many particular names, as I just said, but there's a consistent theme that runs through them all. There's a pattern that runs through them all of consistency, and this is the man-made test that Ellen White talks about. Selected Messages, Volume 2, page 14. The devisings of men's minds will invent tests that are no tests at all, that when the true test shall be made prominent, what is the true test? Sabbath. That's the test. That's the God's test. That when the true test shall be made prominent, it shall be considered on a par with the man-made tests that have been of no value. Now, folks, we've just seen that happen. We've just seen that happen. You know, do you folks over here know something about the Worldwide Church of God founded by Armstrong? Okay. Now, that was a Sabbath-keeping church. They started out keeping the Sabbath, which we no doubt learned from Seventh-day Adventists. There are some who think that Armstrong had quite a close contact with us at one time. I've never checked into that. I don't know. But in any case, they started out as a Sabbath-keeping church. Then after some years had passed by, they decided to add to that the feast days, the Passover, the Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Great Day of Atonement, and so they wouldn't work on those days either. And they kept them as holidays, not holidays, but as holy days. And then finally, well, as I see it, what happened here was this caused them to equate the Sabbath with the feast days as if they were all the same. The first idea was to elevate the feast days up to the Sabbath. It resulted in putting the Sabbath down to the feast days. And so just within the last 12 months, they decided to throw the whole thing out. Feast days and Sabbath altogether went out, and it's just torn their little church to pieces. We meet people now and then who tell us they're looking for a church to go to. They don't know where to go because they have been so shocked by what happened in the church that was honoring the Sabbath and now just throws the Sabbath out along with the feast days. All right, let's pick up the story again. We were talking about the fact that Brother Bakioki, a brilliant man who served as an Adventist missionary in Africa, in Ethiopia, as I remember, and became the first Seventh-day Adventist to ever attend the Catholic University in the Vatican area in Rome, and graduated from there with honors, with a high degree, and has moved from there to teaching in our own school. And people continually ask me questions about that. I tell them, I don't know. We'll just have to watch and see. But he came out with a book this last few months, and he says it's Volume 1 and Volume 2 is going to come out this fall, which is we're getting into fall now. He said he's going to spend the whole summer working on the second book. The first book is pushing the Passover and the Pentecost, and the next book, he says, is going to push the Feast of Tabernacles and the Day of Atonement. The fall festivals will come out in the next. And he frankly admits that he got his ideas from the Worldwide Church of God, which just makes me wonder. And it makes me wonder about, is this the devil's attempt to do the same thing with us that he did with them, to cause us to bring in the feast days and put the Sabbath on the same level with the feast days and then see them all go out together? Could it be that he hopes to do the same thing with us that he did with them? In any case, this has given strength to the fanatics in the States. They're greatly cheered by the fact that Bakioki has come out with a book on their side. And again, we've read to you several statements to the effect that the most brilliant man in the whole wide world is no match for the devil. And line after line after line in the book that Bakioka wrote is flatly, firmly contradicting the spirit of prophecy. And he could have been protected from his mistake if he'd been willing to humble himself and read the words written by God's messenger. Folks, when we get too proud and too uppity to read and study the spirit of prophecy, when we think we are so well informed that we just don't need it, we're in a very, very dangerous condition. And it doesn't matter who we are. Now, going back to this thought about man-made tests, God's messenger has dealt with that in several very distinct and clear passages. Evangelism, page 212. The commandment of God that has been almost universally made void is the testing truth for this time. But all man-made tests will divert the mind from the great and important doctrines that constitute the present truth. Pacific Union Recorder, the Pacific Union Recorder of October 20, 1904. God will send us direct and practical tests to teach us, if we will be taught, the benefits of faith. He has no use for man-made tests. The tests that he has given are sufficient. And from the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald of May 29, 1888, it is the third angel's message that bears the true test to the people. Satan will lead men to manufacture false tests and thus seek to obscure the value of and make of none effect the message of truth. The commandment of God that has been almost universally made void is the testing truth for this time. Manuscript Releases, Volume 3, page 56, talking about the Sabbath. This is the Lord's test. Let us not descend from it to man-made tests. Manuscript Releases, Volume 7, page 91. Influences of various kinds and orders will come in to sway the people of God from the saving test for this time, but there will be brought in a vast amount of man-made tests that have not the least bearing upon the work of God. Let's hold that in our minds. They don't have any bearing at all upon our great work that we have before us, spreading the three angels' messages. She talks about here in this quotation that I won't bother to read to you about her early work. It's in Life Sketches, and you can read it there if you want to know more about it. And so the man-made tests, I've told you about what some of them are. We'll pick out some of the larger ones and to study them just briefly now. Just a word about the methodology. As I said, they usually show up at the meetings like this one. They attempt to work out their hidden agenda in the question and answer periods or whatever we have. And when we open question periods, sometimes people will, in the guise of asking a question, try to give a lecture. I'm very glad that you haven't any of you done that here. I appreciate that a lot. And sometimes we just have to press them and say, what is your question? What is your question? And they'll go on and on and on until finally we just demand, please state your question or else sit down. And I'm very happy that I haven't encountered that here, and I hope you don't have trouble with it, but I've had to meet at several places. And they will draw little groups aside in the lobby of the building or outside the corner of the yard or somewhere to try to preach to them their particular theories. And we have to recognize that we are vulnerable because we know that we have been misled by our leadership on certain very important points, and that hurts us. It makes us vulnerable. When somebody comes along and says, now listen to me, I'm going to tell you where our leaders have misled us, we're not able to just brush it aside because we know it has happened before. And so they have a way of approaching us through that window in our minds of where we've been hurt before. We're a little bit sensitive and vulnerable there, and we're not able to just be totally indifferent and say, forget it, I won't pay any attention to you. We are a bit vulnerable, and so we have to watch out for that. But may I say on that point, folks, that our doctrines, the doctrines that constitute the historic faith of Seventh-day Adventists, are not new. They are not this side of 1956. You may not see why I'm saying that and why I'm pointing it out, but I'll try to make this clear. We look around us today at the conditions in the church. We look around us today at the conditions among the leaders of the church, especially among the educational leaders, the educational institutions, the academics, the theologians. And we must not project what we see there back into the past. You see, I have a little advantage of being 76 years old. I joined the church in 1936 when I was 16 years old. I was born in 1920. You got that figured out, didn't you? Well, Questions on Doctrine was printed in 1956, 1957. It took about 10 years before it really made any difference. They were busy circulating it. By getting donations and contributions, they put out 250,000 copies of it around the world in the first few years, and they began to have their effect. By 1966, the book Questions on Doctrine had quite a strong effect all around the world. Now I want to see that as the middle of my 60 years in the church. My 60 years is about 30 years before that time, about 30 years after that time, and I want to tell you there's a difference of day and night. And I'm glad that I am able to look back and see that, because sometimes people talk to me about that age of legalism back there. I say, wait a minute, I was there. You can't kid me like that. I know what kind of people we had in the church in those days. It just doesn't work. To state it simply, that was a different church than we have today. And I have heard several people who had been out of the church for years and came back into it come to me in astonishment and say, what's happened to the church? This is not the church that I left so many years ago. It's a different church. Well, that's true. And it had different kinds of leaders. Back in those years, I served in the Hawaiian Islands for 12 years. And out there, especially at that time, there were very few hotels and motels, especially on the outer islands. And when the world leaders came through to check our work and spend a little time with us and then went on their way to other countries of the far east, across the Pacific, and over to Asia and China and India and so on around, they stayed in our homes. We got to rub elbows with them. We got to pick their brains. We got to get very well acquainted with them. And I can testify that they were godly men. Dedicated, consecrated, godly men, almost without exception. You could trust them, and they would be fair in anything they did, fair to hurting themselves. They were just the kind of men you could trust anywhere with your money or with anything. Well, you wouldn't do that now. To illustrate that, when I was in college at La Sierra, 1945, I graduated. One of our professors there talking to us about the experience in the work, it was a little frightening, what's going to happen to us when we get out there, and the conference committees are going to be bossing us around. What if we displease them and so forth? You worry a little bit about that when you're young, when you're older too sometimes. But anyway, this professor said, listen, fellas, I want to tell you something. No matter what happens, you can trust your conference committee. There's not a better group on earth that you could find to supervise your work than a conference committee. You can trust them. You can trust them. You can trust them. He wouldn't say that now. Another teacher whom I know who used to talk in a similar way to his, he told me himself, he said, I would never tell my students that today, that you can just put your trust without any fault, without any failure in your conference committee. To further illustrate what I'm talking about, when I went to Walla Walla College shortly after joining the church, I joined the church in the spring of the year 1936. In the fall of the year, I went to Walla Walla College to train for the ministry. They were on a quarter system there, 3 months in a quarter instead of a semester system. The first quarter ran from October to December, and then they started the second quarter in January. Before the first quarter was over, it became clear that new faculty members in the Bible department were undercutting the spirit of prophecy. They were destroying students' faith in the spirit of prophecy. And when this became known, the point that I want to show you is that by the end of December, all three of those men were gone from the faculty. And the General Conference sent out two of their best men from headquarters to take their places to make sure that we got the ship back on the right course again and not have any lasting influence of their work there. And I must say that those men were not undercutting the spirit of prophecy anywhere nearly as much as the ordinary teacher in our schools today, in our theological departments of our colleges in the States, at least. I don't know what you have over here. But it just was not acceptable. You undercut the spirit of prophecy, we don't need you here. We're not paying our money for that sort of teaching to teach our young people. That's the way it was in those days. Well, in our time, of course, it's different. In our time, we have the problems that you know full well. I don't need to recite the problems that you're facing to you. You know more about them than I do. But what I'm trying to say is we must not look at the church today and say that our doctrines were figured out by that kind of people. That's not the case. Our doctrines were figured out and studied out by men of dedication, men of consecration, and we know what part Ellen White had to do with that. So when somebody comes along and says, our leaders back there, they deceived us about the doctrines, you've got a big wall of resistance against that other man. Wait a minute. They were a different kind of men back there than we're dealing with today. Very, very different. You don't have to be suspicious of anything like that. They did not deceive us about their doctrines. Now, Ellen White refers to these people as piling scriptures around their theory. She says they make a great pile of scriptures around their theory, which really do not support it, but they're very impressive because it's a big pile. They pervert the spirit of prophecy, and she talks about that. And they sometimes seemingly tell horrible untruths, but we'll let the Lord judge that. We're not going to call anybody a liar because we cannot judge that. Ellen White tells us, and the dictionaries also tell us the same thing, that the definition of the word lie is something that is told with intention to deceive. Now, I may look at what a man has written and say that's absolutely unconditionally false, but I cannot call him a liar because I do not know what his intention is. I don't know what his intention was. The Lord will take care of that. I can just say, well, that's not correct, and I can show you the evidence why it's not correct, but we must not call any names. We must not call anybody a liar. There's an insightful passage in the devotional book for this year on page 103. It is sometimes the case that men of intellectual ability, improved by education and culture, fail to comprehend certain passages of Scripture, while those who are uneducated, whose understanding seems weak and whose minds are undisciplined, will grasp the meaning, finding strength and comfort in that which the former declare to be mysterious or pass by as unimportant. By the way, I'm making too many detours here, but when they tell us that the nature of Christ is a great mystery that the church has never agreed about, when they tell us that sanctification, the doctrine of sanctification, is a great mystery that we've always argued about, that's not true. If you go through the literature of our past like I have done, I eyeballed every page of the old Signs of the Times, the Review and Heralds, the Youth Instructor, and all of the books that were written, and magazines that were published overseas, South Africa, Canada, Australia. I looked at every one of them. You don't find any debate about sanctification there. You find absolute clarity, absolute agreement, total unanimity there about sanctification and about the nature of Christ. You don't find discussions in those pages like we're having now. And so when we hear people say that the Adventist Church has always struggled with the mystery of sanctification, that's not true. I'm not saying anybody is lying, but I'm saying the statement is an incorrect and inexact statement. That we always had disagreement about the nature of Christ, that's not true. We had total agreement. I've told you about the 1,200 statements that we found and published in our book, The Word Was Made Flesh. 1,200 statements by our pioneers, 400 of them by Ellen White. In total 100% agreement that Christ came to earth in the human nature of fallen man, just like yourself and myself. And so when we hear that, just remember that the devil always labored to make the truth appear to be mysterious. And she tells us that the rabbis tried to make the truth mysterious. Dr. Siegfried Horn made a statement at the seminary that surprised me once. He said the rabbis knew how to put 33 different interpretations on any text in the Bible. And he listed a few of them, but I lost interest after the first 2 or 3 and didn't copy them all down. But that's what human minds can do. Brilliant minds, brilliant minds. But they're lacking that hunger for truth. They don't have that love for the truth that we need to have. Now about the Passover, a quick look at the Passover. And I make no apologies whatsoever for using the spirit of prophecy on this, because not only what I believe about the spirit of prophecy, but also because those who are pushing the feast days usually do it with spirit of prophecy quotations, which they mercilessly mutilate. I have told you about the brother who has pushed the idea that the Passover was kept by Abraham. Here's his statement. We are all familiar with the story of Moses and Pharaoh. Most of us have thought until recently that the feast of Passover was given to the Jews at that time. Well, we'll see about that. However, it has already been noted that Abraham kept God's statutes, which included the feast 430 years prior to Moses. He calls it 430 years, that's all right. Well, on the same page, I have a few lines from Ellen White. Desire of Ages, page 76. The observance of the Passover began with the birth of the Hebrew nation. On the last night of their bondage in Egypt, the Hebrews went out from Egypt, an independent nation. That's when the Passover began. Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 217. On that night so terrible to the Egyptians and so glorious to the people of God was the solemn ordinance of the Passover instituted. That's when it starts, if I understand the English language. Review and held November 4, 1902. The Jews had been strictly enjoined to celebrate the Passover. This had been instituted at the time of their deliverance from Egypt. The language that this man uses causes me to believe that he too borrowed his ideas from the Worldwide Church of God. A Worldwide Church of God leader published a book on the feast days, and I believe that this man and Bakayoko both got their ideas from that book. Well, there are several pages of these, but I cannot spend time on all of them, but there are pages and pages about the Passover. These are all statements about when it began, what it meant, and the fact that it was a transition between the two economies. But here's especially this one. Talking about the Lord's Supper. It was Christ's desire to leave his disciples an ordinance that would do for them the very thing they needed, that would serve to disentangle them from the rites and ceremonies which they had hitherto engaged in as essential, and which the reception of the gospel made no longer of any force. Watch this. To continue these rites would be an insult to Jehovah. There was a time in my experience when I would say to people, well, if you want to observe the Passover, who cares? That's all right, but I don't say that anymore. That's an insult to Jehovah. That's an insult to God. I have pages of this, and the best thing I can say is if the need arises, write to me, and I'll communicate many of these things to you, but I can't take time to share them all with you now. Then there are pages of statements about the ceremonial law being passed away and what it consisted of. And then there's a lot about the statutes and judgments, which people talk about sometimes. But we want to go on. I should say that this good brother, who published that Abraham kept the Passover, as he says, 430 years before Moses' time, he also said that Ellen White did not recognize the importance of the Passover because God withheld it from her mind. I wonder how he knows that. You think you can explain that to me? And there are other things of that kind involved in it, all of them of the same general class, but I must hurry on. We must say just a little bit about the reinterpretation of prophecies, and I have statements in my files where Ellen White deals with the prophecies, and the most significant one is in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4, as I remember, where she says, prophetic time closed in 1844. Another one where she says, there will never again be a message for the people of God based on time. But we have people who are telling us that, yes, the 2300 years expired in 1844, but it's going to be reapplied later on as days, not years anymore. And so they're setting up 6.5 years up here, which they do various things with. They don't all agree, but they all agree that we'll go to hell if we don't accept their theories. That's the one thing they do agree on. And the sacred name and the Trinity. Here's another one that we're getting a lot. We have sacred name societies now. And they come along with our arguments about the sacred name. Let me see. There was a whiteboard here at one time. Right, is there a marker back here? Is there anything to write on that with?
It's coming.
Oh. I just want to show you a very simple little fact about name. That's all right. I'm just going to use the top of it. I'm going to write something here. This is a city in the Pacific, South Pacific. If you've been there and you know how to pronounce it, I ask you to remain silent and let the other people figure it out. P-A-G-O, P-A-G-O. How do you pronounce that? Pago, Pago? No. Pago, Pago? No. Keep trying. Don't give up. Is there anybody here who's been there? No? Pongo, pongo. Okay, you're right. But that's the way they say it. If you go down there and say pongo, they know exactly what you mean. Pongo, pongo. Now, what I want you to think about is, how long would you have to study that before you would know how to pronounce it pongo? If you looked at it for 6 hours or 10 hours or 6 years or 10 years, would it finally dawn you, oh, there's pongo there? Is that what you would say? Well, that's ridiculous. You say, what's that got to do with the name of God? It's got a lot to do with the name of God. We understand what a name is or any word means in two ways. By looking at it and by hearing others tell us what it's all about. And that's the first thing you want to remember. For approximately 1,000 years before Christ was born, the Jewish people never pronounced the name of God. It was too sacred to be pronounced. They would not take it upon their lips. And for about 2,000 years afterward, most Jewish people still will not pronounce the name of God. The conservative Jewish believer in New York City today will never say the name of God. He will say Hashem, which means the name. When he's talking along, he wants to refer to God, he just says Hashem. That's the name, and that's understood. You don't say that name. It's too sacred. So no human ear has heard that pronounced for somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 years, as far as I can tell. So how is anybody going to come along and say, I know how to pronounce it? It would have to be by divine inspiration, would it not? The Lord would have to give him a vision and show him that this is the way you say it. Otherwise, he's just guessing. Now, another little detail on that. The Hebrew language in which the Old Testament was written had consonants but no vowels. The vowels are A, E, I, O, U in our language, and sometimes Y. The Hebrew language didn't have any at all. It just had only the consonants, the T's, the R's, the M's, the S's. You say, how did they get along? Well, they got along just like you do with abbreviations. When you see MT period, how do you pronounce that? MT period. Mountain. Again, how long would you have to look at MT period before you knew it said mountain? You could never figure that out. Somebody had to tell you. Okay? MRS period. How do you pronounce that? Mrs. M-I-S-S-U-S. That's the way you pronounce it, but that's not written there. So you see these two factors working together. You have to know the sound because somebody told you. You can't get the sound by looking at that. You never could. Time would be irrelevant. No matter how long you looked at it, you couldn't figure out the sound by looking at those letters. But you don't have any trouble with MT period because you know what that means. You don't have any trouble with MR period. You know that means Mr. MRS means Mrs. and so on. You use abbreviations all the time and you don't have any real problem with it because somebody has told you somewhere along the way what it means. Now, you take this fact together that during this time for somewhere, we don't know exactly, but somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years BC, the people stopped pronouncing the name of God. Nobody heard it then. You come up to about 600 to 800 years after Christ, and a group of Jewish scholars who were called Masoretes, that's from the Hebrew word Masorah, which means tradition. They began to worry that the younger Hebrew people coming up were losing their knowledge of how to pronounce all the Hebrew words. They just were afraid that the Hebrew language was going to be lost. And so they developed a system of what they called vowel points. They would have their consonants in their words, and they would put little marks underneath the consonants, and that told you whether it was an ah or an a or an e or an e or an I that you were supposed to combine with that consonant as you went along reading the word. But now, please listen carefully. Even they would not pronounce the name of God. Even they would not put consonants there for the name of God. What did they do? Well, they had the vowels, Y-H-W-H, as we would see them. Some bug is attacking me here. I see. They would not put consonants under the Y-H-W-H. As we would describe it in English letters, Y-H-W-H, the four letters, they called it the tetragrammaton, scholars do, which just means four letters. Those were the consonants for the name of God, but they would not put vowel points for that name there, even if they knew them, which is doubtful. After 1,500 years or so, it's doubtful that they knew them. What did they do? They took a different word completely, and they put the vowel points for it underneath the vowel points of the name of God. The other word was Adonai, which means Lord. And so they put the vowel points for Adonai underneath the consonants for the name of God. And then the Jewish reader, he understands all that. He's been told. He comes reading along, he comes to the name of God, he says Adonai, and then goes right on with what he's doing, and so he has not violated the tradition of speaking the name of God. That's the way that. So what I'm trying to tell you is, for somebody to come along at this time of the world's history and tell us, I know exactly how the name of God should be pronounced, he would have to have a vision from God. There's simply no other way that he could know things like that. And yet, although they don't all pronounce it the same way, some of them say it has to be Yah, some of them say it has to be Yahweh, and so forth and so on. They don't agree on how it's pronounced. They're very, very firm that it's essential. If you don't pronounce it right, you'll very likely lose your soul. But folks, is that the kind of a God we worship? No. If you've been serving the Lord all your life, doing the very best you know how to serve the Lord, he's going to say, sorry about that, friend. You didn't pronounce my name right. I'm going to have to send you to hell. What kind of a God would do a thing like that? That sounds like the God of Calvinism to me. That doesn't sound like the God I worship. But now, you don't have to remember all of that. If somebody challenges you on that and you can't remember all of these things that I just shared with you, just pose this question. How did the New Testament writers write the name of God? You don't find the word Yahweh in the New Testament. You don't find the word Yah in the New Testament. Now, that's a very simple answer to the question. Somebody challenges you about pronouncing the name of God, just ask that question. How was it written in the New Testament by the inspired apostles who wrote the New Testament? I think that's a simple, short answer to the question that can be useful to you. The Trinity. Again, I think I better just give you a quick little response to that instead of going into all the details about it, because our time is running out. I don't want to interfere with the program that is to follow, and my time is more than past just now. Just for something really quick on this subject, and if you need more information on this, write to me. Isaiah chapter 48. Take a careful look here. Isaiah chapter 48. Look first of all at chapter 48, verse 12. Hearken unto me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am he, I am the first, I also am the last. Does that remind you of anything? Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1. Who is the first and the last, the beginning and the end?
I am.
Jesus Christ, the great I am. All right. Now go down. That's the one who's writing this, who's speaking here. Look at verse 16. Come ye near unto me, hear ye this. I have not spoken in secret from the beginning. From the time that it was, there am I. And now count, please. The Lord God and his Spirit hath sent me. How many does that count up in yours? That's all I get, too. I get 3 out of that. Please turn to Isaiah 61, verse 1. And start your counting at the very beginning. Isaiah 61, verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. How many do you count there? The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. And you can go to Matthew 3, when the voice of God spoke from heaven, and when the Spirit was seen descending as a dove, and then Christ was in the water. So you have 3 people in 3 different places. And there's much, much more on that, but our time is more than past. And I mustn't take special time away from this bread-making class that's going to come next. So if you will forgive me, I won't take time for questions now because I've talked too long. If you have serious questions about what I've presented that are troubling you, always feel free to write to me. I'll answer you if I can.